So Father Murphy went into a pub in Donegal, and the first guy he saw, he said, "Do you want to go to heaven?" The man says, "Well, sure, I want to go to heaven." He says, "Okay, go stand over next to that wall." So the second man he comes to, he says, "Do you want to go to heaven?" And the man says, "Well, sure, I want to go to heaven." He says, "Go stand over next to that wall." Well, then he goes up to O'Toole, and he says, "Do you want to go to heaven?" And he says, "Father, no, I don't want to go to heaven." And the father says, "Well, I don't believe this." He said, "Well, you mean when you die, you don't want to go to heaven?" He says, "Oh, no." He says, "When I die, I want to go to heaven." I thought you're getting a group get together right now to go to heaven. Okay. You know, heaven's this kind of thing out there that we sort of create, and you know, it sounds great, you know, but if you give somebody a choice in the moment, I think most of us kind of want to hang around for a while to kind of see what life has to offer for us in these physical bodies. And our Christian theology is kind of interesting in the sense that we go through this process, you know, especially through the Easter process, which is, you know, the crucifixion, the time in the tomb, and the resurrection. But one of the things we don't talk about very much is the fourth part of that, which is the ascension, which is Jesus actually making the ascension into heaven. And in a sense, it actually occurred 40 days after the resurrection. In other words, he hung around for 40 days, did his teaching with the disciples, and then just in this moment experience, he just shot up into the clouds and ascended into heaven. Now, an angel came after the ascension happened, and he said, and here are the disciples, and this is sort of the picture that's created, is they're kind of looking up and they're stunned. You know, it's like they're stunned. And he says, the angel says, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking into heaven? This Jesus who is taken up from you into heaven will come in the same way as you saw him go into heaven." And so he was sort of breaking this trance, and he said, "Now just, you know, cool it, guys. He's gonna come back in the same way he went." Now, this sort of passage kind of initiated this whole idea that somehow Jesus was going to descend out of the clouds and come back and establish, you know, whatever is going to be established, which is talked about in Revelations. And there's a whole lot more to it than that experience, because the stories of the Bible are really stories of our internal process and what it is that we are unfolding in our own life experience. And they are couched or shared in the framework of things that happen around us, because that's the way we best understand it. We're tactile beings. We touch, we see, we feel. We have all these senses. And so in order for us to comprehend something, we have to be able to visualize it. We have to be able to hear it. We have to be able to put it into a context so we can understand it as human beings. But the process is really one of a spiritual process. And the first thing that we know is that 40 days is not necessarily 40 days. The number 40 biblically represents a long period of time that it takes to complete some spiritual process. So 40 represents a longer time period than, say, 3 days in the tomb, or 7 days. So 40 days represents a long time. So it isn't necessarily 40 days. It might be 40 hours. It might be 40 weeks. It might be whatever it is. It's a period of time that it takes for spiritual completion. Now, ascending and descending is a state of consciousness. And so when we ascend in consciousness. We become closer to God consciousness. We begin to understand or begin to see life through the eyes of God. And so we ascend in our process. So Charles Fillmore said that in The Revealing Word, he said, "Ascension is the ascending or progressive unfoldment of man from the spiritual, from the animal to the spiritual, from the human physical self to the spiritual self. It is measured by 3 stages or states of consciousness. First is the animal, second is the mental or psychical, and the third is the spiritual. Now, Jesus first manifested himself as the man on the physical plane, from which he was resurrected to the mental or psychical, and from thence he ascended to the spiritual. And it is the same process that we go through whenever we deal with a period of time in our life where we are faced with challenges and issues and concerns, and we go through this, all of us go through crucifixion experiences in our life. Don't we? I mean, we set ourselves up in some way, shape, or form, or we find ourselves involved in some situation where we are in a period of dealing with difficulties in our life. And you think about Jesus' experience, essentially he set himself up. In other words, he went around and he created the conditions as a result of him sort of getting in the face of all the authorities of his time. He set himself up for what he knew was going to be a difficult period or a part of a process. Sometimes we set ourselves up, but we're not really thinking about it. In other words, we create the conditions in our lives where things show up in our life that are challenging. We go through difficult times, and those times challenge us to our core. And it's important to know that what this story represents is a process that will help us to visualize what it is that we're going through, so that when we're going through it, we can see what the outcome is going to be. We may not know what the outcome is going to be specifically, but we can see that it's something that's good. It's something that is for our highest and best experience. So we always experience crucifixion in our life. We've all done it. We've all had it. We've all had moments where we felt like somebody was pounding nails in our hands. You know, may not be physically done, but we've had those moments. It's felt like it. And so when we're in those moments, the story really tells us that, hey, there's something else going on. There's something else happening in our experience. And so Jesus stood there in that moment, and we understand this to be such a painful moment. And haven't you had painful moments? Haven't you had moments in your life when you felt like it was over? Like when I can't go past this point? So he's in that painful experience. But what does he do? You know, he doesn't start dumping on everybody around him. He doesn't start yelling at people. He doesn't start doing what he does is he forgives. The simple process of, Father, I forgive you. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Now, how is he able to do that? He's able to do that because he understands that he's in a process. And the ultimate end of the process is going to be something incredibly good. And so he's able to do that because he's conscious of that. And so he goes through the crucifixion process. He dies and lets go. And then he's in the tomb. Now, the tomb is a period of time where it's quiet. It's a period of time where things kind of level out or stabilize, or you're kind of in that space. And so he's in the tomb, and then as the time is right, in this case it was 3 days, it was a relatively short period of time in the tomb, then he comes out of the tomb. He resurrects into a new experience. And at the resurrection, he is awake, he's conscious, all of his faculties are working, and then he spends his time finishing what it is he needs to do, and then what does he do? He ascends. Which ascension is essentially moving into God consciousness. It's that moment in our experience when we can look back on what it is that we went through, and we can see it through the eyes of God. We can say, well, now I understand. Well, now I know why this happened. Now I know why this difficulty came up. Now, I'm more awake. I understand more. I'm more present in the world. This was an important step. You know, how many of our experiences that we look back on, would we give up the growth that we got in order not to have had the experience? That becomes often the question. Would I give it up? You know, would I give up? Would I go back to that place that I was beforehand? And most of the time, we wouldn't. Most people I ask say no, they wouldn't. They wouldn't want to go through it again, okay? But they wouldn't give it up. They wouldn't give up that experience because they understand how important that was to awakening, to becoming more awake, alert, to the ascension, to ascending into an experience of God consciousness. You know, for me, it's kind of when I find myself in that space, is what carries me through the challenges and the moments of my life is a simple affirmation that I'm in the flow of I don't know. but God does. I'm in the flow of I don't know, but God does.